New video shows a major strike near Freedom Square in Ukraine's second largest city of Kharkiv. Here is the aftermath. As Russia escalates its attack, the country is now being accused of war crimes for targeting civilians as a massive military convoy heads toward the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. This as the humanitarian crisis worsens. The UN Refugee Agency says at least 677,000 people have fled Ukraine to neighboring countries so far. And the UN says there's a growing number of unaccompanied and separated children among those refugees. UNICEF says there are reports of families arriving at the border, handing over their children to border guards, and then remaining in the Ukraine. The Ukrainian military and militias made up of civilian soldiers have put up a tough fight against Putin's forces. But now the Russians are bringing more force. Let's bring in senior investigative reporter Aaron Katersky in Ukraine, along with ABC's Elizabeth Schulze in Washington for more. Aaron, the Russian Defense Ministry says that strikes with precision-guided munitions ruled out damage to civilian infrastructure and apartment blocks. But video appears to show otherwise, that video coming out of Kharkiv. So is this disinformation?
Well, look, we're not really sure because we haven't had a look up close, but the Russians are saying they're not targeting civilian infrastructure. The Ukrainians said plenty of civilians have been killed or wounded, as many as 400, and that's probably a low estimate at this point. The Ukrainians also accused the Russians in an earlier bombardment of Kharkiv of using cluster munitions to maximize civilian casualties. Many countries outlaw cluster munitions, although not around here. And it's really worrying because as the Russians have suffered some setbacks in the early part of an invasion that has not gone to plan, the fear is they will rely more on heavy artillery, less on precision-guided munitions, and be a little more indiscriminate about their targeting. That there's some history there with the Russians. Think back to Chechnya, and so there's some real fear of what the Russians may have in store.
And Elizabeth, given those allegations against the Russians, Secretary of State Antony Blinken addressed the UN Human Rights Council earlier and openly questioned whether Russia should be allowed to keep its seat on the council. Let's listen.
One can reasonably ask whether a UN member state that tries to take over another UN member state while committing horrific human rights abuses and causing massive humanitarian suffering should be allowed to remain on this council. If President Putin succeeds in his stated goal of toppling Ukraine's democratically elected government, the human rights and humanitarian crises will only get worse.
So, Elizabeth, could Russia actually lose its seat on the Human Rights Council? And how significant would that be if it does happen?
Diana, it's unlikely this would happen, certainly overnight. But what this is significant is that it shows it's part of this larger effort to isolate Russia from the community internationally, this diplomatic front to make Russia on its own as the rest of the nations kind of bond around this idea that it is a pariah here on the diplomatic stage. You know, we heard Secretary Blinken there reference the human rights violations. He says they are mounting by the hour, specifically referring to that attack that we saw in Kharkiv, saying it is very clear if you look at that this is there's going to likely be evidence of human rights abuses here. And it's something that the UN is messaging as well, not just on the ground as far as the military operations, but also the need to pay attention to the refugee front for additional humanitarian and military aid. This is a clear focus right now from the rest of the UN, as well as from Secretary of State Blinken.
And Aaron, what is the latest on the fighting there? How are things looking at this point?
Well, we've seen some fairly significant blasts in the suburbs of Kyiv, the capital. In Kharkiv, again, an administration building came under attack from what appeared to be a missile, and there was a giant explosion that did catch some civilians in that fire. It happened after curfew. And now it's getting dark a bit, and it looks like another long and restless night ahead. We've seen satellite images of the large convoy that's coming in from Russia, tanks and troops and artillery pieces. And if it's true, as U.S. and Western defense officials fear, that Russia really does plan more devastating attacks on this country, that's going to mean more time in basements at a moment's notice, or sheltered, and it's taking a real toll on the population. I was at the main Lviv train station today when a train all the way from Kharkiv came in, and it has to go back. And I was talking to the conductor. He said he's really scared to go back into that restive area but he's committed to trying to get more people out. Before the train left, it wasn't going to go empty. An army of volunteers came with water and food and diapers and loaded it onto the seats where passengers had been, because they know that that city's going to need resupply.
And Elizabeth, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is applying now for his country to join the EU, and he's calling on European leaders to prove that they are with Ukraine by doing this. What are the chances that the EU does accept Ukraine under the circumstances, and what impact could that have?
Well, Diana, this is certainly the message from President Zelenskyy, that you should show that you stand with us, the EU, by admitting us in through this expedited process. And essentially, the EU has said that it's open to this. It hears this message. You know, President Zelenskyy made an incredibly emotional appeal to EU lawmakers, saying that we are fighting for democracy here. And he was met by a standing ovation from many of the lawmakers in the room, who clearly understand the position that he's coming from. That said, the process of actually joining the EU is incredibly complex. On its own website, the EU says that it's something that does not happen overnight. So getting this on this kind of expedited basis that President Zelenskyy is requesting is not something that would be easy. There's a general process in place here. It requires integrating countries into the European market. And ultimately, it's something that would not happen perhaps on the scale that President Zelenskyy is hoping for, as we are looking at this by the hour, by the day here in Ukraine.
And Aaron, the UN is now saying over 600,000 Ukrainians have fled the country and crossed into nearby borders, into nearby countries. But what is this like for those who've stayed behind? Because we do know that there are a number of Ukrainians who are still either at home or somewhere in their local cities bracing for this.
Diane, could you imagine being a man of fighting age and seeing off your kids and your wife and letting them go to some other country, not knowing when you're going to see them again, and not exactly knowing what your role in the resistance is going to be? There's a lot of pride, and there's certainly a willingness of people to take up arms in defense of Ukraine, and I think they've been emboldened by some of their early successes, but no one's under any illusions about how long they can possibly hold out. We've seen a determination here, though, to take up arms, to make Molotov cocktails. I even was with a group of volunteers sewing camouflage nets for the frontline military units to use. They're ripping fabric and out of donated clothes and stitching them together to make these camouflage nets. And one woman told me she can't pick up a weapon. She doesn't know how to use a gun, but she has hands, and that can be her contribution. Yeah, we know some are even doing things like baking bread, you know, round the clock, so that soldiers and anyone else in need will be able to have it when the time comes. We're also hearing reports from UNICEF now that some are showing up at the border with their children and handing their children to border guards and then going back into Ukraine. So, Elizabeth, the latest estimates now coming from the UN are saying this could be up to 4 million people in the coming days displaced by this conflict. How is the U.S. planning to respond to the humanitarian crisis angle? Well, we know that the State Department, the Pentagon, and the White House have already kind of issued this third package of relief. That includes military aid, but they're also focusing on the humanitarian aid as part of that. You know, part of the problem is actually getting supplies to the area, getting it where it needs to go. But there is no doubt a push here, and there's a push in Congress now to authorize additional aid on the humanitarian front. People are looking at these photos and understanding the severity of what is happening and wanting to help. And that's a message that we are hearing here in Washington from lawmakers, from the White House, too. Diane. All right. Aaron Katersky, Elizabeth Schelsey, thank you.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.